But just before I start, I wanted to outline a few issues that, in my tenure in the job as transport correspondent at The Guardian, that I would like to see covered tonight, or perhaps broached. Network Rail, as I said, is kindly sponsoring tonight's event. I think one issue is whether in a year's time they'll be able to afford to sponsor anything, because they received £3.7 billion from the taxpayer last year. That equates to nearly a quarter of the DfT's budget. Now, that investment, it's a complicated thing. It's protected by the Railways Act, so you can't just go and cut it. What the Railways Act protects is Network Rail's expenditure from 2009 to 2014. Nonetheless, it appears to me that if we are going to achieve meaningful reductions in state expenditure on transport as per the Comprehensive Spending Review, then somehow Network Rail's expenditure has to be tackled. I'd like to get a bit of a debate going on that tonight. Secondly, future-proofing desire to travel by rail and by bus. It's going to be quite difficult to do that, I think, if, for instance, you cut the bus service operators grant, which is £500 million a year. As the Undersecretary of State, Norman Baker, has said, that is going to result in potentially higher fares. And as bus operators have said, if you cut it, it's definitely going to result in fewer routes on certain bus networks. And also, just looking at the Conservative Party ethos, which is about encouraging greater private sector involvement in transport. You can see many ways in which that will work. For instance, Virgin Trains has argued for the deregulation of rail fares. At the very least, we're probably going to see an increase in rail fares in the wake of the CSR, what we expected. Is that politically feasible? Is that going to result in fewer people travelling by train? The RSC Foundation has said one way of getting private involvement in the roads network is by privatising or putting in trust the major roads, i.e. the Highways Agency and their estate. So there appear to be many sort of structural consequences to the government's fiscal policy, potentially. If you're going to reduce government spending by 25%, then the private sector has to fill the gap somehow, and that's where the future-proofing is going to come. But that implies quite big structural changes in certainly public transport, and I'd like to get everyone's ideas as to what shape those should take, from reforming the franchise network franchise system to reforming Network Rail to how you cover the gap left by potentially phasing out the bus service operators grants. Anyway, lot to cover. So our speakers are going to speak for between 5 to 7 minutes. Our first speaker is, we're very privileged to be joined by her tonight, is Theresa Villiers, the Minister of State for Transport. In the time that I've been covering transport, Theresa oversaw one of the big policy announcements, if not, well, from my point of view, the biggest policy announcement that the Conservative Party brought in opposition, which was replacing a third runway at Heathrow with a high-speed rail network, a north-south high-speed rail network. And that was a big initiative, a big move that was indeed replicated by Liberal Democrats and by Labour to an extent. So Theresa, if you don't mind taking the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank both Network Rail and Policy Exchange for sponsoring this event tonight and bringing it together, and of course to thank Dan and the rest of the participants on the panel for taking part. It's welcome to have so many opportunities at this conference to discuss the future direction of transport policy in the age of austerity. The urgent need to tackle the deficit has dominated the news for 2 years now, understandably. If we don't put the public finances back in order, we can't create the economic stability we need for jobs and growth. And it's not so different from a credit card, the longer you leave it, the worse it gets. We inherited a position from our predecessors where the government was borrowing £1 for every £4 that it spent. It doesn't take a maths genius to know that that's unsustainable and that we need to make cuts to deal with the deficit. That's the bad news. The good news is that the Chancellor has repeated on a number of occasions that he recognises the economic benefits generated by capital investment in infrastructure and capital investment in transport infrastructure in particular. One of the themes that we've been asked to address this evening is how we decarbonise our transport system. As Dan has said, one of our major decisions in opposition was to oppose a third runway, partly because of its impact on local environmental factors and the corrosive impact of a major uplift in aircraft noise for the surrounding communities, but also because of our concern about the carbon impact of a third runway. But coupled with that, as you've heard, was a commitment to constructing a high-speed rail network for the United Kingdom. Now, our commitment in opposition was to take high-speed rail to the north of England, to Leeds and Manchester. We've built on that with the announcement yesterday by the Secretary of State, giving more indication about what route we're taking. But we do see that as a first step towards delivering what is genuinely a national network, though we accept that those things can take several years to deliver. But that is our direction of travel. We see it as a crucially important opportunity to boost regeneration across the country, to help close the prosperity gap between north and south, and to provide a lower carbon alternative to thousands of short-haul flights. But we also believe that it's vitally important to green the car fleet, to make driving a much greener alternative, because, as the Secretary of State sort of emphasised in his speech to the conference, the car is always going to be a very significant part of our transport network. So we will never reach our carbon goals if we don't reduce emissions from driving. So the support we've given to electric cars was one of the few spending programmes that was confirmed prior to the spending review, demonstrating how seriously we view this. But it is also true that we need to encourage modal shift, and that is one of the reasons why last week at the Lib Dem conference, my colleague Norma Baker announced that we would create a local sustainable transport fund to support low carbon modes such as cycling and walking and bus travel. In order to try and achieve the modal shift, we need to reach our carbon goals and to address congestion, and coupled with that is a major simplification of the funding streams for local authorities. So overall, as we've heard, the likelihood is that there is going to be less money, but we want to ensure that there are far fewer hoops to jump through, so local authorities have more freedom to deploy resources for the local transport solutions that suit their communities and their area. We are very much, the sensitivities around BSOC, I think Dan's absolutely right to have raised this. Prior to the 20th of October, of course, it would be wholly inappropriate for me to reveal any details about what the settlement for the Department for Transport might look like, but I don't think one has to be on the inside track to realise that transport will feel part of the pain. So there must be a prospect that potentially that will impact on BSOC. Though I think Dan was slightly pessimistic when he talked about, he seemed to anticipate that it was going to disappear completely. But yes, potentially there can be an impact on BSOC. We wish that wasn't the case, but that does mean we'll have to think carefully about how the schemes run to try and get the maximum benefit for the grant as it currently stands for local for bus operators. We're very conscious of the importance of that stream of funding, and we're taking into account all the relevant issues in the discussions we're having with the Treasury, and in particular we're very conscious of our equalities duty and the impact on local communities, on vulnerable communities, on rural communities. In terms of the idea of future-proofing and giving a degree of certainty to long-term investment in infrastructure, it is a perennial problem that the delivery time for infrastructure projects in transport tends to be a great deal longer than the ordinary political cycle. So many of these, particularly a high-speed rail network, will stretch over a much longer period than a 5-year parliamentary term. And one of the goals of the coalition is to try and to go for more longer-term thinking, more longer-term decisions, to stretch the political horizon so that we look to the long term rather than the short term, and in particular look at in the decisions we have to make about efficiency, savings and cuts, we do need to look at the whole life costs of projects. It would be very short-sighted if short-term cuts led to larger overall costs in programmes. So in terms of the decisions we make on efficiencies and where those cuts have to come, we are certainly looking to the long-term consequences of our decisions. But I think one way to help future-proof infrastructure investment is to try and build cross-party consensus. And one can see that in relation to high-speed rail, also for other projects which we're undertaking. We made our support for Crossrail clear in the coalition agreement. And again, there's a range of other projects which we're very supportive of, as well as high-speed rail, as well as Thameslink, strategic freight network, electrification of further electrification of the rail network. All of these are positive. All, of course, are subject to decisions in the comprehensive spending review, and all will be affected by affordability considerations. But we strongly recognise the importance not only of high-speed rail, but of continuing to upgrade and improve our existing rail network to deal with the capacity pressure we already see on it, but also to help us meet our long-term goals in terms of reducing carbon and re-energising the economy. And with those types of projects, we are working extremely hard to keep them all affordable. The most high-profile work on this is being undertaken by the team in charge of Crossrail, who've done some fantastic work in reducing costs, and that kind of value engineering is something we're looking at across the board, and is another part, I think, an important part of future-proofing transport investment, improving government procurement skills and ensuring that as projects go forward, we do the maximum we can to keep them affordable, to keep them within budget. But another issue that I know this audience will be very interested in is the future of the rail network. It's absolutely clear that we need better value for money on the railways. I am the first to welcome the really significant achievements that we've seen on the railways since privatisation. A 40% increase in passenger numbers would have been inconceivable at the time of privatisation. It was, many people thought that this was a question of managed decline. Well, that has been completely transformed. And of course, in recent times, we've seen some record levels of punctuality as well. So there is some very good news on the railways, but the reality is that the contribution by the taxpayer to running and maintaining the railways has doubled in the last 10 years or so. And if we're to provide the railway we want to, if we're to improve service in the way passengers want, if we're to deliver the capacity improvements that passengers want, then costs in the railway have to come down. There are many ways in which we need to focus on that. The McNulty review is informing our thinking, but it's clear that the industry needs to work better together to bear down on costs and improve value for money. It's clear that we need to do something better in terms of aligning the incentives of the different sides of the rail industry. And it's clear that we need Network Rail to make Network Rail more accountable so that we bear down more strongly on their costs. They have made some advances in reducing costs, I recognise that, but the reality is that it's still a major concern that the Office for Rail Regulation only a few weeks ago published figures that indicated that the costs of running the railways in other European countries can be as much as 40% less than Network Rail's costs. And we also, though, need to look at a wide range of areas. For example, we need to look at the way we approach rail safety in this country. Now, we've got an exemplary record, and it's essential that we maintain that. But we do need to look at whether we're delivering that safety record in the most efficient way possible. We need to start to bite the bullet in terms of very difficult industrial relations issues on the railway. I think that's something that's taken far too long to get a grip on. We will face some difficult times ahead if we're to put the railways on a more financially sustainable footing and improve productivity and working practices. I think the industry needs to look to see whether engineering practices across the range of the network are being applied in a sufficiently kind of granular way. I know it's a repeated criticism, there's often a one-size-fits-all approach to engineering, whereas the same standards that you might need on the West Coast Main Line with your ultra-fast pendolinos aren't necessarily appropriate for a small branch line with a couple of trains every 2 hours. So those are some of the areas we're looking at, but I'll just wind up on franchise reform. We believe that this is an important way that we can improve efficiency on the railways, get a better deal for passengers, better services for passengers, and importantly to lever in some much needed private sector investment. The reality is, if an operator gets a 6 or 7 year franchise, it's very difficult to think of major investments which may have a very long-term return being viable. If we move to franchises of 10 or 15 years, or in cases where significant investment programs are promised, then we're perfectly prepared to consider longer franchises. We've made it clear that we'll continue to protect the passenger interest robustly, so we'll still have some demanding targets or requirements on things like perhaps crowding, perhaps passenger satisfaction. But what we want to do is to give the people running the railways more flexibility about how they deliver on those targets, rather than trying to micromanage their business, as sometimes seems to be the case in the past. And I think we need a more qualitative approach. In the past, the focus had just seemed to be, under our predecessors in government, very binary consideration of the bottom line, the subsidy to be paid or the premium to be paid. We think we need a more qualitative approach to value for money for the taxpayer, which actually judges the long-term plans an operator might have to invest in the railways, grow passenger numbers, and innovate to improve life for passengers. So there's a lot of work going on in relation to the railways and the future of the railways. I look forward to the contribution you might have and your questions on those issues, and indeed any of the others that I've kicked off the debate with this afternoon. Thank you.
How much we have to cover this evening. That's very broad coverage of all the issues that we face, just on that issue of transport investment in the age of austerity. But our next guest is someone who can really give us a lot of insight into that as well. That's Paul Plummer, the Director of Planning and Development at Network Rail, who's essentially responsible for planning what tomorrow's railway will look like, i.e. the best and most affordable projects, and whether the government should invest in them. More personally, even more personally, he's an expert in railway finances as the former Director of Economics and Finance at the Office of Rail Regulation.
Thank you, Dan. And just say a few things very briefly to start. First of all, cost. I mean, Dan raised a question about Network Rail costs has to be tackled. Of course it does. That's what we're here for. We took out 27% in the last 5-year period, and we know how to take out another 22% in this 5-year period, and we're well on track with that. So that's in hand, and at the same time, as Theresa said, the railway's been growing better and better in terms of outputs as well. So we'll keep on with that. To go beyond that, one of the things we think we need to do is to work in much better deep partnership across the whole industry, Network Rail with train operators. I think that means devolving accountability within Network Rail so that people are accountable at a more local level for what they do, and they're able to partner with train operators at that level. That's quite a change in terms of the way we've done things. We had to take a very controlling approach to get costs down, to deliver outputs in the initial period. Having got control of the business, then we're now in a position actually that we wouldn't have been able to do a few years ago to really push that on. And I think that that means partnership, and that means greater devolution of accountability, as I said. So it's the best of both worlds there that we were looking for. I thought Dan was going to suggest that Rail might not even exist, but I do think that what we would be looking for is to be able to retain the best elements of a genuine integrated national network, which has important things in terms of economies of scale in some activities, in terms of being able to plan and operate that network, in terms of being able to deal with very scarce capacity in the most efficient way, balancing performance, journey times, frequency, and so on. Working with operators on those things, but doing so as network level. Providing for competition where that's sensible between operators, allowing freight operators who use the whole of the network to have fair access to that. So retaining some of those really important things that are about a network, but at the same time getting much more effective partnership with train operators and working with them to help them grow revenue and having them help us to deliver projects and other things more efficiently with this less disruption. So that's what I mean about the best of both worlds that we'd be looking to achieve. The other thing I'd say briefly around planning, and really more directly to the question of the future-proofing the railway. Network Rail with train operators has been doing a lot of work in the last year or two, really to begin to be able to say this is how we think the railway could develop over a long period of years. Government's decision on High Speed 2 is fantastic example. We're looking further ahead, but actually we need to be able to work back into the nearer future and say, well, what does that mean we need to do now for the optimization of that scarce capacity over the next few years, making best use of that to grow value for operators and for the taxpayer to take costs out of the industry. So there's a huge amount to be done there, and key that we will be looking to develop with government, with local funders, with operators. I think there's some fantastic opportunities there, and we really need to then think harder about how we prioritise those things. Prioritise them around what investment in infrastructure can do for generating economic growth, around what it can do for the environment. And examples around that, which I think will be continue to work on. The Northern Hub is a great example where local funders have said, if you could do this in terms of railway outputs, this is what it would enable us to deliver in terms of the economy and environment. And the industry together able to say, well, actually, then that's how we could deliver those things. So that's the sort of thing we need to now develop. We now need to find a funding solution for that opportunity and take that forward. Similarly, electrification, another great example where actually it's about saving costs. We need to invest money to actually make the railway cheaper over a number of years. Other schemes like that, but all of them I think we need to have in our mindset that we need to prioritise those investments around what we can do for generating economic growth in a sustainable way in the environmental concerns we all face.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, some very interesting comments from Paul there about devolving accountability within Network Rail. I'd just like to mention the Association of Train Operating Companies, the industry body for franchise operators, has proposed taking that several steps further, and in fact devolving Network Rail into regions, and then possibly taking some of those regions and merging the track owner and maintainer with the train operator. So for instance, Wales, Scotland, ScotRail, Arriva Trains Wales could be a sort of could be guinea pigs for that sort of approach, but that obviously goes much further than what Network Rail's proposing, so perhaps that's something we can discuss later. Our next speaker is Richard Hebditch, Campaigns Director for Campaign for Better Transport, an extremely prominent voice in the transport industry, and they've scored another hit today with a study which claims that, a poll which claims that 7 out of 10 commuters will vote for someone else, another party, if that party, i.e. the Dems and the Conservatives, lifts the cap on rail fares. So, arguing a sort of political meltdown if anything happens on fares. Again, something to debate later. Richard.
Thanks so much. I might come to that at the end. Before I start, we start off with some thanks. I'd also like to thank Theresa for speaking at so many fringe meetings. She spoke at ours yesterday morning, and I think it shows a real willingness in terms of the new ministerial team as well for transport to actually go and talk and listen to people and carrying on from opposition as well, where we found that very refreshing. I spoke at the equivalent fringe meeting 2 weeks ago with the Liberal Democrats, where we started off being incredibly depressed about the future for transport. And actually, maybe it's the Liberal Democrats themselves, they suddenly entered in more optimism as we went through the discussion. So it'll be quite interesting to see what your views are for actually what the future of transport holds. We, the Campaign for Better Transport, we were formed back in 1973 as Transport 2000, and what we're really about is trying to promote transport that improves quality of life and protects the environment. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of the economic side of things and what we're doing today. We've been working quite a lot in terms of the spending review. We published something called Smarter Cuts, which is a report back in June looking at what the opportunities were for making cuts for transport and some of the proposals behind that. And that's going to govern really what I talk about now. It's very difficult to try and work out what was in the Department for Transport budgets and the complexity of all the different areas and the many different funding streams, as I'm sure you will have. And the difficulty of working out, for instance, also what's capital spending and what's revenue spending, what's supporting services and what's actually going into capital spending. And I think it's important to think not just about capital, about investing in new infrastructure, but actually trying to make sure we maintain existing transport infrastructure and existing transport services as well, whether that's making sure that the roads are maintained well, whether that's about making sure that the public transport services are maintained, and particularly as we've been talking about in terms of buses. There have been wide variations in terms of what's happened to bus passenger rates over the last few years. In some areas there's been real success. I think the danger is if there are changes to bus service operators grants and other forms of support, actually we need to make sure we avoid having a spiral of decline, and obviously that's a very important priority for the spending review. I think it's also about thinking about the efficiency of transport networks themselves. So for the road network, rather than necessarily thinking about big new road programs, actually about how can we make sure we make best use of the road capacity that we have, whether it's in terms of things like active traffic management or things like using the hard shoulder running on motorways. So turning to investment, the Eddington study from a few years ago found that the UK was already well connected. We've got 200 years of investing in the transport system. We have a very extensive transport system. It's just a bit old and a bit run down largely. So I think sometimes the parallels that people talk about in terms of China as spending X billion on new high-speed rail, on new road capacity, are not necessarily that helpful. We're not the same as Taiwan. It's about making sure, well, not the same as China. It's about making sure that our system works well, and that when we target investment to improve the way it works. You sometimes hear people who just seem to think that it's about making it easier to import goods from China, and that's the role of the transport system. But it's about trying to unlock the potential, I think, of our cities and making sure that that's a particular priority. One of the things that we particularly welcomed with the new government is looking at changes to how we actually appraise transport spending and work out what our priorities would be. It's very welcome to hear about the changes there are to the NATA approach, actually looking about some of the more wider environmental impacts and not putting such an important emphasis on very small time savings. So one road where I think 70% of the value of it was about small time savings of less than 50 seconds over the next 60 years. That doesn't really represent good value for money. We need to make sure that actually what we're prioritising is spending that has a real impact in terms of reducing carbon in particular, but also in terms, I think, in the next few years about trying to make sure we support the economy and support the creation of jobs. I'm going to talk very briefly, hopefully, about just two main areas, one of which is freight and the other one is of urban areas. We published a report yesterday looking at lorry road user charging, which is in the coalition agreement, and looking about what a system might look like that would actually encourage greater efficiency in the freight sector in terms of improving the amount that is carried on each load rather than having empty running, and reflecting the coalition's concern to make sure there's a level playing field with foreign hauliers, but also looking about how you might generate some income from lorry road user charging to actually reinvest in the freight sector to improve its efficiency, to improve its standards, and look at things like freight consolidation as well, and looking about trying to encourage more cooperation between hauliers. We're also keen to see expansion of freight on rail as well. We think that part of that is about how we have strategic planning and how we prioritise spending. There is a danger that the move towards having much more localised planning, the removal of the regional tier, could see it making it more difficult to, for instance, have things like freight terminals, of being able to see those through, but also about making sure that the strategic freight network is supported and that we support capacity improvements. One of the real benefits for high-speed rail, if that comes about, is actually freeing up space for more freight on rail. In terms of urban areas, I think part of it is about the investment in terms of making sure there's rail capacities. I think Paul mentioned the Northern Hub and looking at capacity there and other places as well, but also about the opportunities for light rail to encourage a shift away from the car and actually kind of reduce congestion. But I think it's also important in terms of the smaller scale improvements that you might make. To some extent, that's about the way we design our towns and cities, the way we plan them in terms of trying to encourage walking and cycling more, to try and reduce the amount of use of the car for short trips that adds greatly to congestion. And we can do more in terms of actually supporting, kind of giving people information to encourage behaviour change as well. The Smarter Choices agenda, the Sustainable Travel Towns that the last government supported, they offer real opportunities. So we're very pleased to see the local Sustainable Transport Fund announced 2 weeks ago. It's very important that that's both capital funding to make small-scale improvements in the the road network, for instance, to encourage walking and cycling, and in public transport infrastructure, but also making sure that there's revenue funding as well to support employment, to actually kind of improve the information, give people information about what travel opportunities there are, where that can demonstrate a real kind of change in people's behaviour. I think localism does offer great opportunities. I think one of the key things for that is also about the funding side of things, actually about whether local transport authorities have long-term funding to be able to make long-term investment decisions and drive forward improvements. Transport for London has had that, although that might disappear with the spending review. We'll see in terms of whether that is long-term funding or whether that is simply the lifetime of this spending review, the changes to that. I'll finally end with some concerns. Obviously, October the 20th we're all looking forward to. Theresa will be able to actually tell us then what's in it. Our other concerns are about strategic planning, as I was saying. The last government did develop the Delivering a Sustainable Transport System approach, which was perhaps overly complicated. But I think it's important to actually have a kind of a general approach to how we choose priorities within transport. I think there is a transport policy emerging from the government. The priority has been to deliver the spending review, but it would be good to see actually kind of that develops into a more strategic approach. So there are elements emerging in terms of the speeches from ministers, but I think we'd be very pleased to see that taken forward, and also looking to see what happens to the national policy statements on things like the national networks, ports and aviation, and that will be very important to go forward. There are good signs in terms of things like announcements about the Green Investment Bank and about the Local Sustainable Transport Fund. But I am going to quickly end on something we've done today, looking at the dangers of actually, when we think about transport, when we think about transport investment, we also need to think about actually people's willingness to support that and their willingness to switch to greener modes of transport like buses and trains. The Bus Service Operators Grant is very important in terms of making sure the buses don't become yet more expensive in relation to the car, but also in terms of train travel as well. So the current system where most prices are regulated at 1% above the inflation rate, the rises that come in each January. We're very concerned about moves to, say, RPI plus 2%, or as we understand, RPI plus 3%, and the very massive increases that there would be in rail prices, so sort of over a third higher by the time of the next election. We're very keen that actually the pricing is an essential part of trying to move towards a greener transport system. If we're pricing people off public transport, that's not going to help us deliver our carbon reduction strategies, and that has to be part of how we take forward transport policy.
Yeah, it's a very good point on fares by Richard, and indeed, I think that's where Network Rail obviously come in. If they can lower industry costs, then perhaps fares can stay lower as well. Just on the DfT budget, it is really complicated. I've got a printout of it on my desk, and it's still taken. I showed it to a Conservative Party figure who shall remain nameless downstairs, not Theresa. And I said, "This is my idea of the budget. Is this exactly how it works?" And he just said, "Don't know." So it's quite a thorny subject.
Pretty arcane science,
Yeah.
understanding the DfT budget.
It is very difficult. Hopefully someone might be able to who won't shed some light on it, but nonetheless has got many interesting things to say. It's Dr. Robert McIlveen, who's a research fellow at Policy Exchange and recently completed his PhD in research methods at Sheffield University.
Thank you. The combination of the economic crisis and also climate change, which I think we gaze over slightly, is actually quite challenging. On the economic side, there's also the tension between getting better value out of the network, but also restoring growth, which is obviously the other side of the challenge. On the rethinking, getting the most out of existing networks, as well as building exciting new things and capital spending, we should also be thinking really about how we're managing things and whether we can actually get better value for what we already have. I was delighted that Theresa mentioned the train franchise system, which I think is long overdue for quite radical rethinking. I'm a regular traveller on the East Coast main line, which actually has competition, which is quite exciting. So going up to York, there are 2 train companies, it's absolutely great. On roads, there's also the issue of road pricing. I know this reached a bit of a political death a few years back, but I think it's something really to think about for the medium term. in terms of really realising the value of the asset that is the road network, it's certainly something that we might want to talk about. It's also getting the most value out of existing programmes, thinking about what we subsidise, why and for who. My parents very recently turned 60, got their free bus passes, and have suddenly started using the buses again. They hadn't used the bus for about 30 years, and all of a sudden, because it's free, they're going to. I think it's well worth thinking why we're spending sort of increasing demand when there isn't that necessary demand there on that, although Theresa may not want to comment on that ahead of the CSR. On economic development, the role of transport is really very crucial, especially for areas which don't necessarily have great connections to London or to the major cities. Meet any newly elected MP for Norfolk and they will immediately grab you and tell you about the importance of the Cambridge to Norwich line. This has happened to me several times, and they're very fixed on getting that upgraded and actually thinking some innovative financing ways to do it, to reap the economic benefits and to use those benefits to then pay for the upgrade itself. It's also the issue of lines, not just to London, we do have a very radial transport network, but also between other major cities. Trying to get from Sheffield to Liverpool, which isn't actually that far, is a surprisingly sort of slow process, for instance. So I think we really think about how the network can develop for those cities which have got relatively poor connections to other parts of the network, is an area we should definitely look at. Uncertainty in investment is one of the other main things that always comes up. It was certainly mentioned during our infrastructure projects, which some of you may remember from last year and should be on all your seats. And I was struck that Theresa mentioned the political cycle and the importance of it, and of course it is important, but also the level of sort of historic micromanagement that the DfT has had in the transport network actually in some ways increases the intensity or the importance of that political cycle. The fact that the DfT has very significant levels of control over things that ordinarily I'm always quite surprised about the things it does have control over, which of course means that the political cycle becomes much more important. If we had a slightly less politicised version, if the DfT was strategic still, but not necessarily as involved in the day-to-day management, the political cycle might well become significantly less important as a source of uncertainty. Of course, not all uncertainty is bad, but I think coming back to the franchise system, it's well worth reconsidering whether the natural uncertainty in economic life, I mean recessions happen, and the inflexibility of the franchise system is a core part of the problem. If demand moves, train companies you'd thought should be able to really adjust their services much more than they can in reaction to that. And I think rethinking that is certainly essential. On the contribution of transport to climate change, this is something that's often brought up, and actually on mitigation, it's very easy to get very excited about it. It would be marvellous if more people could get the train to work in the morning, although if you try to get the train to work in the morning at the moment, it can be a fairly horrifically packed experience of where they'd actually get on the train, I'm not entirely sure, without more capacity, which I'm sure will be coming down the line. In terms of alternative fuels, it's exciting, but also it's very easy to get overexcited. We did some work last year on biofuels, and essentially they're a really great source of low carbon transport. You actually have to look at the scale and demand for energy needed by them. And looking at the biofuels for road transport, you suddenly realise that the amount of land you're talking about growing is on, it's really, really challenging. It's not basically practical for biofuels. Electric and hydrogen vehicles probably are more practical. However, you have to, of course, then ask where you get it from. Electric cars powered by coal is not necessarily quite as green as electric cars powered by nuclear. So that's something that really does have to be taken into account. I always remember Boris on Top Gear saying the electricity comes from the plug, which I suspect means you haven't quite thought through it. And it's true of the electrification of train lines is absolutely really, it's not necessarily the most glamorous or exciting investment, but it's actually a really important one. That should definitely be very high up the list. One last sort of point to leave you on. The interaction between transport and energy decarbonisation is quite important. If we're really serious about very significant levels of electrification of ground transport, that has quite significant implications for the generating sector. We need much more electricity generated, and given the challenge of installing renewable and nuclear capacity, that would could quite possibly end up actually burning more fossil fuels by moving it around. So it's very easy to address, to see electrification as an answer. And it's part of the answer, but it's not necessarily as easy as it sometimes looks. However, I'm very confident that certainly in terms of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, none of the challenges are beyond the wits of man to conquer. It's certainly a sector that can contribute a lot and can be very resilient. Whether economically, the challenge is probably more, in terms of time, is much more urgent, but it can also be a big part of the solution of how we get out of recessions for areas outside London and the South East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yeah, really interesting line in there, just getting better value from what we have. Another phrase that's going around is getting better results from less investment, and it's maintaining what is a very efficient bus and rail network, for instance, in the UK, no matter what the negative publicity says, with less investment going in over the next 4 years. And that is a key issue to face. I appreciate we're a bit short on time. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the speakers there. Has anyone got any questions? And if they have, can you keep them short, and I'll take them in groups of 3 if that's okay. So, gentleman at the front, the lady there, and the gentleman there, please. Gentleman at the front. No, there isn't. Don't worry. It's just.
Yes, well, actually, because I live in London, and the real question is Crossrail. And actually, I was talking recently to Brian Coleman on the GLA, and he's very unfavourable of Crossrail. He doesn't like it. Frankly, it's a banker's branch line, actually. That's the trouble. Now, the point is, you're spending a large amount of money on Crossrail. Could you either not simply stop doing it, and then get hold of all the tube networks which have got a limited size, and bring them up to the loading gauge of British Rail, which would not be terribly wouldn't be all that expensive, and then connect them to British Rail proper, so that they would all then run through the centre of London without changing trains. The point, of course, here is that almost certainly it's far cheaper than Crossrail, and you'd have a large number of very happy commuters because they'd have to stop changing trains so frequently.
On Crossrail, we support Crossrail. It's in the coalition agreement. We are working to keep it affordable, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. It is a project which is very important in terms of the capacity pressure on the transport system in the capital, and it will yield very significant benefits, not just for London and the South East, but for the United Kingdom as a whole. I'm well aware of Councillor Coleman's views, but on this issue, I'm afraid he and I will have to disagree. In terms of your ideas about how one might radically change the tube network, I suspect that might involve some quite significant costs.
I would agree, but it might not be as expensive as Crossrail, that's the point. And has anyone ever worked out those costs?
Sorry,
Well, I mean, that brings me on to the tube upgrades, which are obviously another very significant capital project. Again, this is a matter for review under the comprehensive spending review as part of the discussions with the Mayor of London in terms of the TfL grant. But we are under no illusions as to how very important, again, not just to the economy of London, but the economy of the United Kingdom, of ensuring that we do take forward improvement of a tube network, some of which still operating on signals that date back to the 1920s. So there may be difficult decisions ahead on all of these projects, but we will know the outcome after the 20th of October.
Can you quickly get your thoughts on that? Thank you.
In terms of Crossrail, people have been looking at options for years and years, and the number of things that have been looked at is enormous. So, just making tunnels a little bit bigger is quite difficult. And the idea that commuters would be quite happy about shutting those existing tube lines while you do so, I think is quite right. I mean, one of the things you learned from West Coast route modernisation, for example, is that upgrading existing lines, be it heavy lines or underground lines, is very disruptive and very expensive. And one of the reasons in terms of high speed 2, similarly in terms of Crossrail, why you would go down that sort of route to deal with the next phase of capacity is because it actually, building on a greenfield site, is much cheaper, less disruptive, and can be delivered more quickly. So all sorts of reasons I think that we should carry on with Crossrail as well as with High Speed 2 as the next phase of growing capacity on the railway.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Sorry, James, we have to move on. Sorry, I forgot to ask if you could ask them simultaneously. So the lady there, followed by the gentleman there, and we'll take that as a double question.
Thank you. Denise Turner-Stewart, Surrey County Council, representing Spelthorne. You've talked about a number of infrastructure rail projects. I wonder if you could inform us as to your views on AirTrack, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, gentlemen.
Fairly brief, just two small points. One, I live in Devon, Richard Copus. I travel semi-regularly up to London. For the last 10 years or so, I've taken advantage of super advanced fares, which are only marginally more expensive than taking a car. And millions of other people throughout the country are now taking the train. If they go up a bit, millions of other people will start taking the car again, including me. Second thing is, can we have a bit of common sense about branch lines? Branch lines, I understand, so perhaps Network Rail can confirm this, actually have to comply with the same regulations as main lines as far as safety, etc. are concerned. Can we have the equivalent of a light rail regulation for branch lines to encourage people to use branch lines, park their cars there perhaps for free at the stations, and then use the main lines and take the traffic off the roads?
Thank you. I'll just ask the Minister about AirTrack first.
It's quite difficult for me to comment on AirTrack because the department, I think, is acting in a quasi-judicial capacity in relation to that project at the moment because there's certain approvals I think that have been asked for. So I need to be fairly careful in what I say. I know that it is very important to improve rail connections to Heathrow. I've long championed the idea of integrating Heathrow into the high-speed rail network. AirTrack has been under discussion for a number of years. There are other options in relation to improving rail connections, and I think all of them need to be carefully considered. And also, it's difficult to predict what, if any, public support will be available in terms of funding. So, sorry not to be able to give you too much of a straight answer on that. There's a rather lot of variables that mean I can't give you one. In terms of fares, I think it sort of makes sense for me to address this issue given the introduction and the importance of this issue to everyone. The current formula is RPI plus 1, as I'm sure many people in this room will be aware. That is the position we have at the moment. Whether we will have to change that depends on the outcome of the comprehensive spending review. We may have to take a number of difficult decisions in relation to transport, as we will have to in a number of other areas. We are looking at different options, but no final decision has been made on what the approach to the fares formula will be in the coming years. I would distinguish, though, the gentleman there talked about super advanced fares. They are not currently regulated, so wouldn't be directly impacted by a change to the fares formula, should that be a decision to be made. In terms of branch lines, I think you're talking about, I missed part of that. You're looking at the idea of encouraging using branch lines.
Well,
as
it's
kind of
also a
railhead,
cost saving, I didn't make
encouraging
clear.
people
If you actually reduce the regulations and treat them as light rail, which a lot of countries do, and you don't have to have, for example, you cross the line, these single track lines that we have in Devon and Cornwall, cross the lines of having to go over a bridge, when you've only got one small train an hour doing 30 miles an hour maximum anyway. The cost would savings, Network Rail, would be phenomenal. Quite a bit. You could put some of that saving into.
Yeah. Well, I think that basically, I think these are very interesting ideas. I'm pretty sure Network Rail is looking at some of those options, and those kind of options, I think, we need to consider in the work that we're doing to reduce the costs of running the railway.
Okay, so Robert and Richard, the effect of just sort of boiling that question down to a simple issue on fares. Fares go up, car use increases. Is that a obvious conclusion to draw?
Well, it's not necessarily a fixed amount of travel, of course. I mean, the response of demand for travel in terms of, if we subsidise prices such that they were too low, we don't know the answer to get on. So it's a bit of a moving target. Certainly there's a balance. I mean, car transport is going to be with us, and I think that's there is a balance between them. I suspect it's a question of where we can get best value from from the division between the taxpayer paying part of the cost of travel and fare pay.
But Virgin Trains told me that if fares go up by RPI plus 3%, which is another campaign by Transport said, they regulated fares, they won't take that increase because passengers just won't travel with them.
There's a point where you'll just get in a car and put up with the hassle of going into London or into Birmingham.
Yeah.
I think so. I think part of it is also about recognising the sort of the non-user benefit which justifies why government support for the rail network is important in terms of also keeping prices down as well. Steve Norris, not exactly a kind of hard left socialist, is always kind of stresses the importance of that, the non-user benefits of taking people off the roads, the benefits of reducing congestion, the benefits of improving air quality by reducing the amount of car travel, also helps in terms of walking and cycling. There are many additional benefits from trying to encourage people to take the train. We need to invest in the railways to increase capacity, and there is a difficult balance between, as Norman Baker was talking about making the railway attractive now in terms of pricing and attractive in the future. But I think that if we are serious about our commitments to reducing the amount of CO2 from transport, then actually the price of public transport as a whole is really important. Particularly, I think the relative cost as well, as you were saying, in terms of actually kind of it's just going to simply going to be cheaper to drive. There is talk about what happens to environmental taxes, to green taxes, and the new government are trying to improve that. But what has happened for the last 13 years is that the price of motoring has gone down significantly, and the price of rail has gone up, and the price of bus travel has gone up even more. And that's simply not sustainable if you want to try and encourage that mode shift. You can't get everyone walking and cycling for all journeys. You have to have some public transport if you want to try and reduce climate change. And the Committee on Climate Change has said that even with the most ambitious rollout of electric vehicles, you still need to reduce the amount of car travel in order to meet the ambitious climate change targets that we have.
Thank you. Paul, just quickly on branch lines. There's been a few studies flying around about let's open up a few branch lines and sort of increase demand for rail. I just presume that's really just not feasible over the next 10 years, is it? Given that you're facing less money to do what you have to do, for control period 4, let alone reintroducing moribund bits of the network over the next decade.
I think we need to be looking at both directions in terms of saving costs on some of the branch lines, but in terms of the way the gentleman suggested. But there is a misconception that we spend a huge amount of money on branch lines. We don't. We spend vastly more, and rightly so, on the heavily used bits of railway to maintain those in good order, and the amount we spend on some of these lines is very, very small. And that's appropriate for the traffic. We can do more of that, and that's some of the things we're doing. In terms of the other way you're suggesting, Dan, absolutely. I'd be quite surprised if there were significant reopenings of previously closed branch lines. But I think at the margin, certainly some things in terms of introducing tram services and so on, the tram train services, there will be opportunities there, and we need to look at that. We do these route utilisation strategies, and one of the ones we want to do is to bring more of informed discussion around this with the rest of the industry is around light rail and opportunities there. I do think that's something we need a bit of clarity on, because there's a lot of myth and legend.
Thank you. One question, Lord Barclay.
Tony Barclay, Rail Freight Group. Dan, you and Theresa and also Paul mentioned ATOC's plans for vertical integration, which of course in the freight industry we hate. Because the idea of having another train operator operate the signals and do the timetable and the control is going to completely muck up the whole anybody's national service. And if we want to double our traffic in 20 years, which is the plan, it would be a disaster. I've talked to ATOC about it, and they say, well, they don't want to maintain the network in different areas. They'd be frightened of that. That's what they said. They'd like to run the timetable. I said, why can't Network Rail run the timetable? Well, they don't know how to do it properly. And we got into this discussion, well, why don't you teach them if you think you're so good? And in the end, I said, well, the problem is that what you're proposing is actually illegal. You say, they said that this is what they do in France, but the French government's being taken to the European Court by the Commission for just that proposal at the moment. So I don't know why ATOC's proposing it. Work together, yes, a bloody good idea, but not running it. And I do support Paul in trying to keep that, whatever happens lower down with the regions.
Okay, thank you. So just on that, would the ATOC plan to regionalise and vertically integrate parts of the rail network be a disaster? Do you support the plan?
We are looking at what's going to be the right option, and as Tony knows, in working out what the right option is, a very important factor to bear in mind is maintaining a flourishing rail freight sector. For the sort of reasons that Richard said earlier on, we're supportive of rail freight for environmental reasons, not just carbon, but other pollutants, and in terms of relieving congestions on the road network. So it is, it's an absolute given in whatever direction we go in terms of reform of the rail network as a whole, there must be a strong voice for freight in determining the form of that reform. Now, there seems to me to be a degree of consensus emerging on the importance of closer working between the operators and Network Rail, but there is very clearly a spectrum of options along which one might go. There is a more decentralised Network Rail working more closely with the train operators. There are more sort of closer joint venture type arrangements. We will be considering various different options, but no final decisions have been made, and I know that, Tony, you'll continue to put the freight perspective articulately and strongly, and we will make sure that we don't forget freight in the decisions we ultimately do make on this issue.
Thank you.
I think I said key points in the speech that we want to have the best of both worlds in terms of the benefits of integrated network with devolution of accountability where it's right to do so within that network and really strong partnerships. And I think if you do that, then we can deliver significant benefits over and above what's already happening, and you then wonder why you would want to go any further.
Okay, and so just to refine that, Robert and Richard, how far should the government go in terms of structural reform of the rail industry? Because there's obviously a danger that it will actually lead to widespread disruption and also not achieve the cost cuts that the DfT is looking to achieve over the next 4 years.
We're achieving savings in 4 years with a large-scale reorganisation. That might be very bold given the time it would take for everything to settle down. There might, however, be a sort of big society option potentially. Certainly branch lines would be a potentially very attractive way for people who, if it's a relatively small line that people would value, but there's a community value to it. I think that would be something that could potentially be a very local, cooperative sort of approach to things. And similarly, actually, with the freight, if you have a sort of local, a rail freight terminal or something like that that has particular needs, actually getting the attention at a more local level for that facility would actually be very beneficial for that sort of situation. So I think there's some potential. I think a wholesale reorganisation now would be brave.
I think we've seen a lot of benefits of investment in the rail and actually now delivery of in terms of reliability of the rail network. So large-scale reorganisation would threaten that, and there are importance in terms of the kind of institutional knowledge. But I think everyone recognises that there are very high costs in the UK rail system. There are higher costs across much of UK infrastructure. So in terms of construction costs for the new infrastructure generally tends to be higher in the UK than Europe, which is one of the reasons why high-speed rail is likely to cost quite a lot. But I think that the whole-scale reorganisation would be in danger of losing some of the things that we've gained in terms of the last few years. But I do think that costs are important. I think it's important to maintain public support for the railways as well. So they are seen to be efficient, they are seen to be driving down costs. But to go back to prices as well, that people are able to actually access the railway and afford the railway. And I think that it's important that everyone in the rail sector works to try and make sure that there is public support for the railways as well going forward.
So we're going to have to call it a day on that point, I'm afraid. So can I ask everyone to give a round of applause for our 4 speakers? Sorry. But thank you all for coming.